In this next section, we're going to talk through what it looks like at the unit level when we dive in and look at the 7 lessons that go into each unit. Let's take a look at Unit 1, Identity and Self-Awareness. All of our units have the same lesson flow, and that's introduce, learn, discuss, empathize, reflect, connect, and return. So those are the 7 lessons that go into a unit. We recommend doing about 1 lesson per week, and as a note, each lesson takes about 30 minutes to complete. The first lesson is introduce, and in introduce, we're going to be taking a pre-self-assessment. Each student will do this individually, and then that same self-assessment will happen at the very end of the unit, where students will be able to reflect on what they've learned and how they may have changed after going through this unit. So we'll dive into the first lesson, which is introduce. You see here we have a lesson overview, and then that first task is that pre-self-assessment. If we wanted to, we can click on the questions and you can get a preview of what the questions look like, and then to assign to students so that all the students are sent that pre-self-assessment, you would click this button right here. Then we have our 2 activities, and these activities are always going to just set the stage for the unit. It's before we get to lesson 2, which is learn. And so these lessons, which you'll see, or these activities, are going to be just dipping your toes into the material, and they're usually very fun, very collaborative, very activity-based for students to start thinking about that unit skill. So now that was lesson 1. But if we go into lesson 2, which is learn, this is really kind of the meat of the unit, and this is where students are going to learn about the skill, and they're going to do so in a teacher-led activity. And we provide slides for you here, and so these are the unit slides, and if you click into them, you can see they're ready to go, and there's a lot of discussion that takes place with these slides. So students will get a lot of opportunities to turn and talk and really discuss that unit skill while they're also getting that foundational information. After the slides, students will always complete an activity, and this activity is going to extend that learning and help them activate it and apply it to their own experiences. And so this will always occur after that slide discussion. They'll go into doing an activity, and everything that they will need, materials, will all be right there. Lesson 2 is where the first challenge is assigned. And challenges are short activities or thought exercises that are meant to be completed outside of school time. These help children translate and apply the skill into their own lives. And then it asks them to do a short reflection about their experience completing the challenge. So again, you can assign that challenge to students, and if you wanted to see what that challenge looked like, you would click here and see what students are going to be looking at themselves and how they can take a moment to reflect. As a reminder, challenges again are done outside of class time, and the point is to activate that learning to help them use that skill in the real world context and not just have it isolated to their SEL time. And challenges will occur in lessons 2, 3, 4, and 5, so right in the middle of the units. If we move on to lesson 3, this is where we discuss, and this is the first time they're going to see a story appear, and it's going to be the featured story. And the featured story is going to be read out loud, and you're going to be doing this whole group. And the teacher really has the opportunity here to model the read aloud and how they're, thinking about connecting the story with this skill. In every single story, there will also be comprehension questions and reflection questions. So comprehension questions are ELA based, they are multiple choice, and the reflection questions are open-ended, and they really connect lesson 2 to this lesson where they are going to be applying the skill to the story. As we've mentioned, storytelling and empathy are at the heart of our curriculum, and so each unit features 3 stories. And stories are all different based on the grade level, and just so that you know, stories are about 1,000 to 1,500 words, and they are always going to be a real-life story of someone who has dealt with the themes and topics that appear in the unit skill Our stories are diverse in terms of our storyteller's background, experience, age, and lifestyle. And we hope to not only reflect the diverse population of students we serve, but to also expose them to all walks of life and help them build empathy for different experiences. And so that's kind of what goes into a story. Again, lesson 3 is meant to be a read aloud with the whole class and then discussing those comprehension and reflection questions together. As we've discussed, lesson 3 also has a challenge in it. So you would assign this to students for them to complete out of class at home time. And that's lesson 3. Moving right along to lesson 4, we have empathize. This looks a lot like lesson 3, except for in lesson 4, they're doing it on their own. There's going to be 2 stories, and it's up to you, the teacher, if you would like to assign all students the same stories or have them do both. Pick one. We have 2 stories in lesson 4, and again, it's up to you based on time and based on your choice. If you'd like the students to choose, pick just one story or do both. And in this, they will see the story, and then they will also have those comprehension and reflection questions, and that will be assigned to students. You can see I've already assigned them to my fake students here. Always, we have a challenge. Again, this is in lesson 4. So the big takeaway for lesson 4 is that students will read stories on their own time, 1 or 2 of them, and answer those comprehension and reflection questions that go along with them. Now we're on to lesson 5. Students have had the opportunity to learn about the skill, to hear about other people's experience with the skill in the stories, and now it's time to craft their own story and write about their experience. And their story will focus on the unit skill. So for this one, it'll focus on identity and self-awareness. In the decision-making, unit, they'll just write a story about a time they had to make a decision. And so if you remember in unit 0, we had a storytelling and a writing template, and this is where this comes to life, where students will be using their storytelling template to write their own story. And so we can click on that here where they can see prompts that guide them to writing their own story. And then there's also always the challenge because we're in lesson 5. So they've just written their own story, and now we're in lesson 6, which is connect. Teachers will have had the opportunity to read through some student stories, and all students have the opportunity when they submit their story in lesson 5 to share their story. They can select a button if they'd like to share it. And so this is really important because teachers will find just a couple of stories, 2 or 3, where students have opted to share their story. They have checked that box and they want to share their story. And the class will go over those kind of safe space norms that we discussed in unit 0 and the importance of listening to other people's stories and withholding judgment, but finding connections and empathy. And then students will listen to a couple different stories from their peers, and they will be asked to make some text-to-text, text-to-world, text-to-self connections with other students' stories. And so that's lesson 6, where we're connecting to others, especially others in our own classroom. And finally, lesson 7 is return. And this is such an important lesson because we don't want units to be thought of as just isolated to that one moment where we talk about them and then we go on to a new unit and we never talk about it again. So this is where we really bring in all the other skills and a lot of the CASEL competencies, and we talk about what the certain skill looks like in context with others. So students will look for connections with previous units, reflect on any personal changes and new insights. And finally, students will take that post-self-assessment in lesson 7 and notice any changes from their pre to post. So this was a walkthrough of unit 1, but all of these 7 lessons that occur. And as a reminder, all of those materials are there right for you. Things are easy to assign and push out to students that appear in students' to-do list. And always check that unit overview to get some background knowledge of what the unit's about, and then at the lesson level, what the lesson is about. I'm going to briefly now talk about some implementation tips and some best practices. As I mentioned in the beginning, we do recommend starting with Unit 0. This unit is meant to set expectations and invest students in the content. So these lessons can be returned to throughout the year. We recommend that you always start with them and potentially hit them mid-year to make sure that students, are really invested, and they also are refreshed on some of those safe space norms and some of the storytelling best practices. We also recommend let's take a look, let's see, for stress management and regulation, when we are in lesson 5, where students are telling their own story. We really recommend that you read the stories that students are submitting. Do not have a student share a story unless you have read it. This is especially important in case there is triggering content or anything that you should be made aware of first. As a mandated reporter, it's important that we are reading these stories from students and making sure to address any issues that we see come up. But please read the stories, not only the students share, but also the ones that are assigned, that are created by Peekapak. And make sure that you feel that they are a good fit for your students, especially when you're in lesson 4, and you have that choice if you want students to read one story or the other. And now a note, I'd mentioned this at the very beginning. If I go to a unit overview, you'll see this part for culturally responsive teaching. And social emotional learning occurs within the context of culture because it is social. Cultures around the world value and promote different social emotional skills. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures definitely promote different social skills. And so because culture heavily influences social emotional learning competencies, we do believe it's necessary to frame your classroom's SEL practices within an understanding that students may demonstrate social emotional skills in unique ways based on their background. In addition, culture is evolving, and we must be cautious to not oversimplify, to generalize, or stereotype any culture. So we do recommend reading through the culture responsive teaching section and the tips that come along with it, and then using your own knowledge of your students' background and needs to tailor the lessons and the content accordingly. So those are some quick tips. We hope that you are as excited as we are to get started.